Side 2.
Dickens Digested. In this, the centenary of his death, I should like to speak well of Charles Dickens. The literary world has united to do him honor as one of the half-dozen foremost geniuses of our great heritage of poetry, drama, and the novel. That I should have to stand before you tonight and direct at that immortal memory a charge of... The word sticks in my throat, but it must be given voice. A charge of vampirism repels and disgusts me. But when Dickens has cast this hateful shadow across the quadrangle of Massey College, I have no other course. This is what happened. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. It was the epoch of incredulity. In short, it was the beginning of the autumn term, and the year was 1969. I met the incoming group of junior fellows, and among the 35 or so new men were some who immediately attracted my attention. But the subject of my story was not one of these. No. Tubfast Weatherwax III had nothing about him to draw or hold one's interest. He was a bland young man, quite unremarkable in appearance. Of course, I was familiar with his dossier, which had been thoroughly examined by the selections committee of the college. He came to us from Harvard, and he was a young American of distinguished background, as the dynastic number attached to his name at once made clear. His mother, I know, had been a Boston wine sap, but young Weatherwax bore what one politely assumed to be, in Republican terms, a noble heritage lightly, and indeed unobtrusively. He was a student of English literature, and he sought a Ph.D. When I asked him casually what he was working at, he said that he thought perhaps he might do something with Dickens if he could get hold of anything new. I considered his attitude rather languid, but this is by no means uncommon among students in the English graduate school. Hoping to encourage him, I said that I was certain that if once Dickens thoroughly took hold of him, he would become absorbed in his subject. Ah, fatal prophetic words. Would that I might recall them. But no, I, like poor Tubfast Weatherwax, was a pawn in one of those grim games, not of chance, but of destiny, which fate plays with us in order that we may not grow proud in our pretension to free will. I saw no more of him for a few weeks until one day he came to see me to inquire about Dickens as a dramatist. I'm one of the few men in the university who has troubled to read the plays of Charles Dickens and relate them to the rest of his work, so this was normal enough. He knew nothing about the 19th century theater, and I told him I thought Dickens' drama unlikely to yield a satisfactory thesis to anyone but an enthusiastic specialist. And you, Mr. Weatherwax, I said, did not seem very much caught up in Dickens when last we spoke. His face changed, lightening unmistakably with enthusiasm. Oh, that's all in the past, he said. It's just as you said it would be. I feel that Dickens is really taking hold of me. I looked at him more attentively. He had altered since first I saw him. His dress, formerly that elegant disarray that marks the Harvard man, the carefully shabby corduroy trousers, the rumpled but not absolutely dirty shirt, the necktie worn very low and tight around the loins in lieu of a belt, had been changed to extremely tight striped trousers, a tight-waisted jacket with flaring skirts, and around the throat, what used to be called, 150 years ago, a belter neckerchief. And was I mistaken, or was that shadow upon his cheeks merely the unshavenness which is now so much the fashion, or might it be the first faint dawning of a pair of side whiskers? But I made no comment, and after he had gone, I thought no more about the matter. Not, that is, until the Christmas dance. There are many here who remember our Christmas dance in 1969. It was a delightful affair, and as always the dress worn by the college men and their guests ran through the spectrum of modern university elegance. I myself always wear formal evening clothes on these occasions. It is expected of me. Of what use is an establishment figure if he does not look like an establishment figure? But somewhat to my chagrin, I found myself outdone in formality, and by none other than Tubfast Weatherwax III. And yet, was this the ultimate in modern fashion, or was it a kind of fancy dress? His bottle green tailcoat, so tight-waisted, so spiky-tailed, so very high in the velvet collar, and so sloping in the shoulders. His waistcoat of garnet velvet, hung all over with watch chains and seals depending from fobs.
his wondrously frilled shirt, and the very high starched neckcloth that came up almost to his mouth, his skin-tight trousers, and could it be? Yes, it certainly was. His varnished evening shoes were in the perfection of the mode of 1836. A date, which had just flashed through my mind, marked the first appearance of Pickwick papers. And his hair, so richly curled, so heaped upon his head, and his side whiskers, now exquisite parentheses enclosing the subordinate clause which was his innocent face. It was, yes, it was certainly clear that Tubfast Weatherwax III had got himself up to look like the famous portrait of the young Dickens by Daniel Maclise. But his companion, no neo-Victorian she. I thought at first that she was completely topless, but this was not quite true. Braless she certainly was, and her movement was like the waves of ocean. As for her mini, it was a minissima, nay, a parvula. She was a girl of altogether striking appearance. "Allow me to present Miss Angelica Crumhorn," said Weatherwax, making a flourishing bow to my wife and to myself. "Assuredly, she is the brightest ornament of our local stage, but tonight I have tempted her from the footlights and the plaudits of her ravished admirers to grace our academic festivities with beauty and wit. Come, my angel, shall we take the floor?"
"Ah, crap," said Miss Crumhorn. "Where's the gin act?" I knew her. She was very widely known. Indeed, she was notorious. But not as Angelica Crumhorn, which I assume was her real name, but as Gates Ajar Honeypot, star of the Victory Burlesque. She was the leader of an accomplished female group called the Topless Tossers. If there is one point that has been made amply clear by the university revolt of the past few years, it is this. Students will no longer tolerate an educational institution which professes to stand in loco parentis. Good advice is absolutely out. Therefore, I did not call young Weatherwax to me the following morning and tell him that he stood on the brink of an abyss, though I knew that this was the case. It was not that at the dance he had eyes for no one but Gates Ajar Honeypot. In that he was simply like all the rest of us, for as she danced, Miss Crumhorn gave a stunning exhibition of the accordion-like opening and closing of her bosom, by means of which she had won the professional name of Gates Ajar. No, what was wrong was that when he looked at her, he seemed to be seeing someone else, some charming girl of the Regency period, all floating tendrils of hair, pretty ribbons, modest but witty speech, and flirtatious but essentially chaste demeanor. I saw trouble ahead for Tubfast Weatherwax III, but I held my peace. I thought, you see, that he was trying to be like Charles Dickens. This happens very often in the graduate school. A young man chooses a notable literary figure to work on, and his subject is so much more vital, so infinitely more charged with life than he himself, that he begins to model himself on the topic of his thesis, and until he has gained his Ph.D., and sometimes even after, he acts the role of that great literary man. You notice it everywhere. If you were to throw an orange in any English graduate seminar, you would hit a fetal Henry James, or an embryo James Joyce. Road Company Northrop Frye's, and Halloween versions of Marshall McLuhan are to be found everywhere. This has nothing to do with these eminent men. It is part of the theopathetic nature of graduate study. The aspirant to academic perfection so immerses himself in the works of his God that he inevitably takes on something of his quality, at least in externals. It is not the fault of the God, not at all. Very well, I thought. Let Tubfast Weatherwax III take his fair hour. He has heard of Dickens' early infatuation with Maria Bednall. Let him try on Dickens' trousers and see how they fit. This meant no small sacrifice on my part. Whenever I met him, I said, as I should, "Good day, Mr. Weatherwax," and then I had to listen to him shout, "Oh, capital, capital, the very best of days, master. Whoop, halloo, God bless us, everyone." Or perhaps if I said, "Not a very fine day, Mr. Weatherwax," he would reply, "What is the odds, so long as the fire of soul is kindled at the taper of conviviality, and the wing of friendship never moults a feather?" I began to avoid encounters with Weatherwax. The only Dickensian reply to this sort of thing that I could think of was, "Bah, hambugs," but I shrink from giving pain. But I saw him. Oh, indeed, I saw him crossing the quad, his step as light as a fairy's, with that notable strumpet Gates Ajar Honeypot upon his arm.
Angelica, he insisted on calling her, poor, unhappy, purblind youth. I longed to speak, but my wiser self, who is, I regret to tell you, a cynical, slangy spirit, whom I call the ghost of experience past, would intervene, snarling, "Nix on the loco parentis," and I would refrain. Even when he came last spring to ask permission to marry Angelica Crumhorn in the chapel late in August, I merely gave formal assent. "I shall fill the little chapel with flowers," he rhapsodized. "Flowers for her whose every thought is pure and fragrant as earth's fairest blossom." I repressed a comment that a bridal bouquet of Venus's flytrap would be pretty and original. I prepared the required page in the college register, but August came and went, and as nothing had happened, I made a notation "cancelled" on that page and waited the event. Poor Weatherwax pined, and I ceased to avoid him and began to pity him. I inquired how his Dickens studies went on. He asked me to his rooms in the college, and when I visited him, I was astonished to find how Victorian, how like chambers in some early 19th century inn of court he had contrived to make them. He even had a bird in a cage. Inevitably, it was a linnet. The most prominent objects of ornament were a large white plaster bust of Dickens, very large, positively dominant, and a handsome full set of Dickens works in 25 volumes. I recognized it at once as the Nonsuch Dickens, a very costly set of books for a student, but I knew that Weatherwax had money. He languished in an armchair in a long velvet dressing gown, his hair hanging over his face, the picture of romantic misery. I decided that, prudent or not, the time had come for me to speak. "Rally yourself, Mr. Weatherwax," cried I. "Marshal your powers. Recruit your energies, sir." I started to hear myself give utterance to these unaccustomed phrases, but with that bust of Dickens looking at me from a high shelf, I could not speak in any other way. So I told him in good round Victorian prose that he was making an ass of himself, that he was well quit of Gates' Ajar Honeypot, and that he must positively stop trying to be Charles Dickens. "Eating your God," I cried, raising my hand in admonition, "cannot make you into your God. Stop aping Dickens and read him like a scholar." To my dismay, he broke down and wept. "Oh, good old man," he sobbed, "you come too late, for I am not eating my God. I fear that my God is eating me. But bless your snowy locks. You have sought to succor me, but alas, I know that I am doomed." I rose to leave him, and as I did so, I tell you this knowing how incredible it must seem, the bust of Dickens seemed to smile, bearing sharp, cruel teeth. I shrieked. It was a mental shriek, which is the only kind of shriek permitted to a professor in a modern university, but I gave a mental shriek and fled the room. Of course I returned. I know my duty. I know what I owe to the men of Massey College, to the spirit of university education, to that sense of decency which is one of the holiest possessions of our changing world. And as autumn wore on, it was this autumn just past, but as I look back upon it, it seems far, far away, the conviction grew upon me that Weatherwax's trouble was greater than I had supposed. It was not that he thought he was Dickens, but that he thought he was one of Dickens' characters, and by that abandonment of personality he had set his foot upon a shadowed and sinister path. One of Dickens' characters, yes, but which? One of the doomed ones, clearly, but which? Which? For me, this past autumn was a season of painful obligation, for not only had I to care for Weatherwax, oh yes, it reached a point where I took him his meals and fed him such scant mouthfuls as he could ingest with my own hands, but I had to adapt myself to the only kind of language he seemed now to understand. One day, it was in early November, I took him his usual bowl of gruel and found him lying on his little bed asleep. "Mr. Weatherwax," I whispered. "Nay, let me call you Tubfast. Arouse yourself. You must eat something." "Is it you, grandfather?" he asked as he opened his eyes, and across his lips stole a smile so sweet, so innocent, so wholly feminine, that in an instant I had the answer to my question. Tubfast Weatherwax III thought he was Little Nell. His decline from that moment was swift. I spent all the time with him I could. Sometime his mind wandered and seemed to dwell upon Gates' Ajar Honeypot. I never nursed a dear gazelle to glad me with its soft black eye, but when it came to know me well and love me,
It was sure to prefer the advances of a fat wholesale furrier on Spadina Avenue, he would murmur. But more often he talked of graduate studies and of that great convocation on high, where the Chancellor of the University confers PhDs magna cum angelic laude on all who kneel before his throne. When I could no longer conceal from myself that the end was near, I dressed his couch here and there with some winter berries and green leaves gathered in a secluded portion of the parking lot. He knew why. When I die, put me near to something that has loved the light and had sky above it always, he murmured. I knew he meant our college quadrangle, for though the new graduate library will shortly throw upon our little garden its eternal pall of shadow, it had been, while he knew it, a place of sunshine and of the laughter of the careless youths who play croquet there. Then one drear November night, just at the stroke of midnight, the end came. He was dead. Dear, patient, noble Tubfast Weatherwax III was dead. His little bird, a poor slight thing the pressure of a finger would have crushed, was stirring nimbly in its cage, and the strong heart of its child owner was mute and motionless forever. Where were the traces of his early cares, the pangs of despised love, of scholarly tasks too heavy for his feeble mind? All gone. Sorrow was dead indeed in him, but peace and perfect happiness were born, imaged in his tranquil beauty and profound repose. So shall we know the angels in their majesty after death. I wept for a solitary hour, but there was much to be done. I hastened to the quad, lifted one of the paving stones of the northeast end, where, until the graduate library is completed, the sun strikes warmest and stays longest. For such a man as I, burdened with years and sorrow, the digging of a 6-foot grave was heavy work, and it took me all of 10 minutes. With a little chisel in my handy pocket knife, it was the work of an instant to inscribe the stone, Hic jacet stabilis weatherwax tertius. And then, as my Latin is not inexhaustible, I continued, he bit off more than he could chew. It was my intention to place the stone over the grave with the inscription downward, so that no unhallowed eye might read it. Now all that remained was to wrap the poor frail body in the velvet dressing gown and lay it to rest. Or rather, I should be compelled to stand it to rest, for the grave had to be dug straight down. It was only then I raised my eyes toward the windows of Weatherwax's room, which lay on the other side of the quad. What light was that which flickered with an eerie effulgence from the casement? Had I, stunned by my grief, forgotten to turn off the electricity? But no, this light was not the bleak glare of a desk lamp. It was a bluish light, and it seemed to ebb and flow. Fire? I sped up the stairs and threw open the door. Oh, what a sight was there revealed to my starting eyes! My hair lifted upward upon my head, as if it were fanned by a cold breath. The bust of Charles Dickens, before so white, so plaster-like, was now grossly flushed with the colors of life. The none-such Dickens, which had hitherto worn its original binding of many-colored buckram, was, oh, horror, horror, bound freshly in leather, and that leather, would that I had no need to reveal it, was human skin. And that smell, why did it so horribly remind me of a dining room in which some great feast had just been completed? I knew at once, for the body was gone. As I swooned, the scarlet lips of the Dickens bust parted in a terrible smile, and its beard stirred in a hiccup of repletion. It was a few days later, last Friday indeed, when a young colleague in the Department of English, a very promising Joyce man, said to me, "It is astounding how Dickens studies are picking up. Quite a few theses have been registered in the past 3 months." I knew he despised Dickens and all the Victorians, so I was not surprised when he added, "Wonderful how the old wizard keeps life in him. Upon what meat doth this our Charlie feed, that he is grown so great, huh?" He smiled, pleased at his little literary joke. But I did not smile, because I knew. Yes, I knew. The Charlottetown Banquet. The range of guests who come to our fortnightly high-table dinners is wide and provides us with extraordinarily good company. Sometimes we get a surprise, an economist who turns out to be a poet, for instance. I mean a poet in the formal sense. All economists are rapt, fanciful creatures. It is necessary to their profession. Only last Friday we had a visitor whom I found a most delightful and illuminating companion. I shall not tell you what his profession is, or you will immediately identify him, and I shall have betrayed his secret, which is that he's a medium. He does not like being a medium. He finds it embarrassing. But the gift, like being double-jointed or having the power to wiggle one's ears, can neither be acquired by study nor abdicated by an act of will. His particular power lies in the realm of psychometry, that is to say, that sometimes, not always, he finds that when he is near to an object that has strong and remarkable associations, he becomes aware of those associations with an intensity that is troublesome to him, and occasionally psychic manifestations follow. He confided this to me just as we were leaving the small upstairs dining room where we assemble after dinner for conversation and a reasonable consumption of port and Madeira. We were standing at the end of the room by the sideboard, for he had been looking at our college grant of arms. He put his hand on the wall to the left of the frame to enable him to lean forward for a closer look, and then he turned to me rather white around the mouth, I thought, and said, "Let's go downstairs. It's terribly close in here." I thought it was the cigar smoke that was troubling him. Excellent as the Bursa's cigars undoubtedly are, the combustion of a couple of dozen of them within an hour does make the air rather heavy. So I went downstairs with him and thought no more about the matter. It must have been a couple of hours later that I was taking a turn around the quad for a breath of air before bed when I saw something I did not like. The window of the small dining room was lighted up, but not by electricity. It was a low, flickering light that seemed to rise and fall in its intensity, and I thought at once of fire. I dashed up the stairs with a burst of speed that any of the junior fellows might envy, and opened the door. Sure enough, there was light in the room. But now you must understand that we had left the room in the usual sort of disorder. The table had been covered with the debris of our frugal academic pleasures, nutshells, the parings of fruit, soiled wineglasses, filled ashtrays, crumpled napkins, and all that sort of thing. But now I have never seen the room looking as it looked at that moment. How shall I describe it? To begin, the table was covered with a cloth of that refulgent bluey whiteness that speaks of the finest linen. And what is more, there was not a crease in it. Obviously it had been ironed on the table. The pattern that was woven into it was of maple leaves entwined with lilies and roses. At every place, and it was set for 24, was a napkin folded into the intricate shape known to Victorian butlers as Crown Imperial. At either end of the table was a soup tureen, and my heightened senses immediately discerned that the eastern tureen contained mock turtle, while at the western end was filled with a consommé enriched with a julienne of truffles, that is to say, consommé Britannia. A noble boiled salmon of the Restigouche variety was displayed on one platter, with a vessel of lobster sauce in waiting, and on another was a selection of filets of the most splendid Nova Scotia mackerel, each gleaming with the pearls of a sauce maître d'hôtel. And the entrée, petite bouche à la reine, a grenadine de veau, and a pique sauce tomate, and none of your nasty bottled tomato sauce either, but the genuine fresh article. There was a lapin sauté, which had been made to stand upright, its paws raised as though in delight at its own beauty, and a charming fluff of cauliflower sprigs where its tail had been a few hours before. You could see that it was served aux champignons, for 2 button mushrooms gleamed where its eyes once had been. There was a côtelette d'agneau, with naturally petit pois. There was a coquette de volaille and a tambal de macaroni, which had been molded into the form of all things, a beaver. In addition, there were roasted turkeys, chickens, a saddle of mutton and a sirloin of beef, and there were boiled turkeys, hams, corned beef, and mutton cutlets, and it was all piping hot. The flickering soft light I had seen through the window came from a gasolier that hung over the table, and through its alabaster globes gleamed the gaslight, surely one of the loveliest forms of illumination ever devised by man. You have recognized the meal, of course. Every gourmet has that menu by heart. It was the grand banquet in honor of the colonial delegates, which was held at the Halifax Hotel in Charlottetown on September the 12th, 1864. This was the authentic food of Confederation. A specimen of the menu, elegantly printed on silk, and the gift of Professor Maurice Careless, one of our senior fellows, hangs on the wall of our small dining room just at the point where our guest, the medium, had laid his hand. Nor was this all. What I have described to you at some length leapt to my eye in an instant, and my gaze had turned to the sideboard, which was laden with bottles of wine. And what bottles! Tears came into my eyes just to look at them. For these were not our ugly modern bottles with their disagreeable government stickers adhering to them, and their high shoulders and their uniformity of shape and their self-righteous airs, as though in the half-literate nasal drone of politicians they were declaiming, "We are the support of paved roads, general education, and public health. We are the pillars of society." No, no, these were smaller bottles in a multiplicity of shapes and colors. There were the slim, pale green maidens of Hock, the darkly opalescent romantic ports, the sturdily gay clarets, and the high-nosed aristocrats of Burgundy. There were champagnes that almost danced, yet were not gassy impostors, and they were all bottles of the old shapes and the old colors, dark, merry, and wicked. My knees gave a little, and I sat down in the nearest chair. It was then that I noticed the figure by the sideboard. His back was toward me, and whether he was somewhat clouded in outline or whether my eyes were dazzled by the table, I cannot say, but I could not quite make him out. He was hovering, I might almost say gloating, over a dozen of sherry. That should have given me a clue, but you will understand that I was not fully myself, and furthermore, I had at that instant recalled that the menu given to us by Professor Careless was said by him to have been the property of the Honorable George Brown. On such a matter one does not doubt the word of Maurice Careless. "Mr. Brown, I believe," I said in what I hoped was a hospitable tone. "God forbid that I should cast doubt on any man's belief," said the figure, still with its back to me, "but I cannot claim the distinction you attribute to me." He picked up a bottle of sherry and drew the cork expertly. Then he drew the cork of another and turned toward me with a wicked chuckle, a bottle in either hand. "These are Clan Alpine's warriors true, and Saxon. I am Roderick Dhu," said he, and I was so astonished that I quite overlooked the disagreeable experience of being addressed as a Saxon, for it was none other than old Tomorrow himself. Yes, it was Sir John A. Macdonald, in his habit as he lived, or rather not precisely as we are accustomed to seeing him, but in Victorian evening dress with a red silk handkerchief thrust into the bosom of his waistcoat. But that head of somewhat stringy ringlets, that crumpled face which seemed to culminate and justify itself in the bulbous coppery nose, that watery, rolling, merry eye, the accordion pleating of the throat, those moist, mobile lips were unmistakable. "If you were expecting Brown, I'm truly sorry," he continued. "But you see, I was the owner of this Minu." He pronounced it in the Victorian manner, Minu. "Brown pocketed as we left the table. It was a queer little way he had of picking up odds and ends. We charitably assumed he took them home to his children. But it's mine, right enough. Look, you can see my thumb mark on it still." But I was not interested in thumbprints. I was deep in awe of the shade before me. I started to my feet. In a voice choking with emotion, I cried, "The father of my country." "Hooky Walker," said Sir John with a wink. "Tuck in your napkin, Doctor, and let's enjoy this admirable repast." I had no will of my own. I make no excuses. Who, under such circumstances, would have done other than he was bidden? I sat. Sir John, with remarkable grace, uncovered the mock turtle and gave me a full plate. I ate it. Then he gave me a plate of the consommé Britannia. I ate it. Then I had quite a lot of the salmon. Then a substantial helping of mackerel. I ate, busily, humbly, patriotically. I have always heard of the extraordinary gustatory zest of the Victorians. They ate hugely, but it began to be borne in upon me, as Sir John plied me with one good thing after another, that I was expected to eat all, or at least some, of everything on the table. My gorge rose. But, I said to myself, when will you ever again eat such a meal in such company? And my gorge subsided. I began to be aware that my appetite was unimpaired. The food I placed in my mouth and chewed and swallowed seemed to lose substance somewhere just behind my necktie. I had no sense of repletion, and little by little it came upon me that I was eating a ghostly meal in ghostly company, and that under such circumstances I could go on indefinitely. Not even my jaws ached, but the taste, the taste was as palpable as though the viands were of this earth. Meanwhile, Sir John was keeping pace with me, bite for bite, but rather more than glass for glass. He had asked me to name my poison, which I took to be a Victorian jocularity for choosing my wine, and I had taken a Moselle, a fine Berncastler, with the soup and fish, and had then changed to a Saint-Emilion with the entree. It was particularly good with the rabbit, a dish of which I'm especially fond. Sir John did not want any, and I ate that rabbit right down to the ground and sucked its ghostly bones. But Sir John stuck to sherry. Never have I seen a man put away so much sherry. And none of your whimpering dry sherries either, but a brown sherry that looked like liquefied plum pudding. He threw it off a glass at a time, and he got through bottle after bottle. You must not suppose that we ate in silence. I do not report our conversation because it is of slight interest. Just another slice of turkey, my dear doctor. Allow me to give you the liver wing. And, Sir John, let me press you to a little more of this excellent tambal de macaroni, and may I refill your glass? Oh, you've done it yourself. You know, that sort of thing, the polite exchanges of men who are busy with their food. But at last the table was empty, except for bones and wreckage. I sat back, satisfied, yet in no way uncomfortable, and reached for a toothpick. It was a Victorian table, and so there were toothpicks of the finest sort, real quill toothpicks, such as one rarely sees in these weekly fastidious days. I was ready to put into effect the plan I had been hatching. In the bad old days, before the academic life claimed me, I was, you must know, a journalist. And here I found myself in a situation of which no journalist would dare even to dream. Across the table from me sat one whose unique knowledge of our country's past was incalculably enhanced by his extraordinary privilege of possessing access to our country's future. Here was one who could tell me what would be the outcome of the present disquiet in Quebec, and then how I should be courted in Ottawa. Would I demand the Order of Canada? The companionship, not the mere medal, before I deigned to reveal what I knew, and how I should lord it over Maurice Careless. But I at once put this unworthy thought from me. Whom the gods would destroy, they first make mad. I wound myself up to put my leading question. But poor creature of the 20th century that I am, I was mistaken about the nature of our meal. "Ready for the second course, I think, eh, Doctor?" said Sir John, and waved his hand. In a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, the biblical phrase popped into my mind. The table was completely reset, and before us was spread a profusion of partridges, wild duck, lobster salad, galantine, a plum pudding, jelly, pink blancmange, Charlotte Russe, Italian cream, a Bavarian cream, a Genoa cream, plates of pastries of every variety, apple puffs, bouchées, cornucopias, croquembouche, flan, strawberry tartlets, maids of honor, stuffed monkeys, prune, fleurie, tortelli. It was bewildering. And there were ice creams in the Victorian manner, vast temples of frozen, colored, flavored cornstarch, and there were plum cakes and that now forgotten delicacy called pyramids. And fruit, great towers of fruit, mounting from foundations of apples, through oranges and nectarines to capitals of berries and currants, upon each of which was perched the elegantly explosive figure of a pineapple. You see, I had forgotten that a proper Victorian dinner had a second course of this nature, so that one might have some relaxation after the serious eating was over. But Sir John seemed disappointed. "What?" he cried. "No gooseberry fool? And I'd been so much looking forward to it." He proceeded to drown his sorrow in sherry. I had no fault to find. I began again, eating methodically of every dish and accepting second helpings of Charlotte Russe and plum cake. During this course I drank champagne only. It was that wonderful Victorian champagne, somewhat sweeter than is now fashionable, and with a caressing rather than an aggressive carbonization. I hope I did not drink greedily, but in Sir John's company it was not easy to tell. I do not mean to give you the impression that Sir John was the worse for his wine. He was completely self-possessed. But I could not help being aware that he had consumed 9 bottles of sherry without any assistance from me, and that he showed no sign of stopping. I knew, once again I was in the debt of Professor Careless for this information, that it was sherry he had favored for those Herculean bouts of solitary drinking that are part of his legend. I was concerned, and I suppose my concern showed. Before I could begin my interrogation, might not my companion lose the power of coherent speech? I sipped my champagne and nibbled abstractedly at a stuffed monkey, wondering what to do. Suddenly, Sir John turned to me. "Have a weed," he said. I accepted an excellent cigar from the box he pushed toward me. "And a B and S to top off with," he continued. Once again I murmured my acquiescence, and he prepared a brandy and soda for me at the sideboard. But for himself, he kept right on with the sherry. "Now, Doctor," said Sir John, "I can see that you have something on your mind. Out with it." "Well, it isn't very easy to put into words," said I. "Here am I, just as Canada's centennial year is drawing to a close, sitting alone with the great architect of our Confederation. Naturally, my mind is full of questions. The problem is, which should come first?" "Ah, the centennial year," said Sir John. "Well, in my time, you know, we didn't have this habit of chopping history up into century lengths. It's always the centennial of something." "But not the centennial of Canada," said I. "You cannot pretend to be indifferent to the growth of the country you yourself brought into being." "Not indifferent at all," said he. "I've put myself to no end of inconvenience during the past year, dodging all over the continent, a mare usque ad mare, to look at this, that, and the other thing." I could not control myself. The inevitable question burst from my lips. "Did you see Expo?" I cried. "I certainly did," he said, laughing heartily. "And I took special trouble to be there at the end when they were adding up the bill. The deficit was roughly 8 times the total budget of this Dominion for the year 1867. You call that a great exposition? Why, my dear Doctor, the only great exposition that made any sense at all was the Great Exposition of 1851. It was the only World's Fair in history that produced a profit. And why was that? Because it was dominated by that great financier and shrewd man of business, Albert, the Prince Consort. If you had any sense, you would have put your confounded expo under the guidance of the Duke of Edinburgh. No prince would have dared to bilk and rook the country as your politicians did, for he would have known that it might cost him his head. Expo! And then Sir John used some genial indecencies, which I shall not repeat. "But, Sir John," I protested, "this is a democratic age." "Democracy, sir, has its limitations like all political theories," said he, and I remembered that I was talking, after all, to a great conservative and a titled Canadian. But now, if ever, was the time to come to the point. "We have hopes that our mighty effort may reflect itself in the future development of our country," said I. "Because you have been so kind as to make yourself palpable to me, I'm going to ask a very serious question. Sir John, may I inquire what you see in store for Canada? The land which you brought into being, the land which reveres your memory, the land in which your ashes lie and your mighty example is still an inspiration. May I ask what the second century of our Confederation will bring?" "You may ask, sir," said Sir John, "but it won't signify, you know. I see, Doctor, that I must give you a peep into the nature of the realm of which I am now a part. It is a world of peace, and every man's idea of peace is his own. Consider the life I led. It was one long vexation. It was an obstacle race in which my rivals were people like that tendentious, obstructive ass Brown, that rancorous, dissident ruffian Cartier, even such mutton-headed fellows as Tupper and Mowat. It was a world in which I would be interrupted in the task of writing a flattering letter to an uncomprehending queen in order to choke off some member of Parliament who wanted one of his constituents appointed to the post of a lighthouse keeper. It was a life in which my every generous motive was construed as political artfulness, and my frailties were inflated into examples
to scare the children of the grits. It was, Doctor, the life of a yellow dog. Now, what would peace be to such a man as I was? Freedom, Doctor. Freedom from such cares as those. Freedom to observe the comedy and tragedy of life without having to take a hand in it. Freedom to do as I please without regard for consequences.
During this long speech, Sir John had finished the final bottle of his dozen of sherry. Those which he had drunk before had all floated, each as it was emptied, to the sideboard, where they now stood in a cluster. He picked up the 12th bottle and whirled it around his head like an Indian club, closing one eye to take more careful aim. "You ask about the future of Canada, my dear sir," he shouted. "Understandably, you want to tell the world what I know it to be, but you can't, my dear doctor, because I haven't taken the trouble to look. And the reason for that, my dear sir, is that I do not give a damn." And as he uttered these fearful words, the father of my country hurled that last sherry bottle at the 11 on the sideboard. There was a tremendous smash, the gaslight went out, and I lost consciousness. How much later it was I cannot tell, but when I was myself again, I was walking round the quad, somewhat dazed, but strangely elated. For although I had been balked in my wish to learn something of the future in this world, had I not been admitted to a precious, soothing, heart-lifting secret about the next? To be a Canadian, yet not to have to give a damn. Was it not glory? And to have eaten the Charlottetown Banquet in such company. A smile rose to my lips, and with it the ghost of a hiccup.